Greetings, everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Andreas Benokratis, and I'm a product manager at Ansible, and I'll be your MC today. We're really excited to have today's Ansible Network Automation webinar is being hosted by Jeff Andiorio, Technical Solutions Architect at WWT, that's Worldwide Technology, and it is entitled Lab Automation by WWT, Ansible Tower, and Cisco DNA Center as a platform. Now, Jeff is no stranger to Ansible. We're really happy to have him. He's an expert in network automation, and he's here to show us how Ansible Tower integrates with larger IT solutions and business processes. And today's is going to be with Cisco DNA Center. We were really happy to have WWT back. We actually have a webinar that was posted before that was one on with F5 and ServiceNow previously. So we're excited to have him back. Now, before we begin, though, I wanted to make sure we go over a few housekeeping items. If you have any questions during the presentation, we ask that you use the chat feature in the webinar app and type your question in there, and we'll try to respond to it. If there's time at the end of the webinar, we'll also address some really good questions there as possible, if there's time allows. And last but not least, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the training and webinars section of Ansible.com by next week. So without further ado, let's kick things off. Next slide, Jeff. So what are we talking about today? I'm going to hustle through these intro slides for myself, and then we can get onto the good stuff. So we're talking about some upcoming events, some updates around network automation in Ansible 2.6, and then the porting guide for 2.6, and then we'll get going. Next slide. So one of the events that we're really excited to be at next week, actually, in Boston, is F5 Agility. We will be there as Ansible and Red Hat, and also WWT will be there. So we're all sponsoring at F5's Agility event. So if you happen to be in the area, if you're attending Agility, you'll definitely see us there. Come stop by and say hello. Next slide. And also Ansible Fest, that's our cornerstone event for Ansible. And this year it was recently announced that it will be in Austin, Texas over October 2nd and 3rd. WWT is a champion sponsor for this event, so they are leading sponsorship role there, and they also will be speaking. They have a speaking slot at a breakout session at Ansible Fest. So if you want to know more about Ansible, you want deep dives, especially on the networking side, there will be a networking track at Ansible Fest Austin. So you feel free to sign up today at ansible.com/AnsibleFest. Next slide. So what's new in Ansible Network Automation? We have a typical connection plugins and modules, and this is for Ansible 2.6 upstream project. We've added an HTTP API, a new connection method that simplifies connections to platform-specific APIs such as Arista, eAPI, and Cisco NX API. This method replaces connection local with connection HTTP API, and this is similar to we are making these connection plugins for network devices as first-class citizens. You might have seen that we've added connection netconf and connection network CLI as top-level first-class citizen connection plugins for networking. So this is a new addition for those that we have APIs where you need to connect to platform-specific APIs. So this is the correct method. We have some more modules, netget and netput. So this allows for downloading large config files and copying up large config files to a network device using SCP and SFTP. And we have the netconfget and netconf RPC as well. So these modules, if you want more information on these modules and connection plugins, head on over to the docs.ansible.com and just search for there. So just a quick update on what's going on in the Ansible world. Next slide. Also, we have some platform support in 2.6. Added Cisco Meraki as part of the inbox Ansible deliverable. We've added 2 platforms from Extreme Networks, SLX OS and EXOS. And I think there'll be more coming in 2.7 from Extreme. F5 added Big IQ module, so licensing can be tough on the Big IP platform, and now we have Big IQ modules for 2.6, which is great. We've actually added full support for InfoBlocks. You might have noticed that we added some InfoBlocks modules in 2.5. These modules are going to be fully supported with a Red Hat subscription with Engine or the Ansible Network Automation product. So the InfoBlocks modules will be fully supported from Red Hat as well as part of 2.6. And lastly, Ubiquiti's Edge OS has been added as well. So that's what's new in 2.6, and I think that's my only slide. You can go to the next one, Jeff. Oh, one last slide. So I can't forget about the porting guide. Porting guide is a great resource when we start moving from versions. The 2.6 porting guide provides really good high-level things that are happening in the release, things that are deprecated, things that were removed, and highlights for specific use cases. So take a look at the porting guide, and that will hopefully help you if you're in 2.5. It'll be a good little change log between 2.5 and 2.6. Next slide. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jeff. Thank you so much for listening, and this is what you come for. So Jeff, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Appreciate the generous introduction also. So good afternoon. My name is Jeff Andurio. Thank you, Andreas, for the good intro. We're here today to talk about how we're automating, how WWT is automating, in this case specifically, DNA Center and SD Access labs within our ATC. I assume you've all seen and read the abstract, so we'll just move on. Like I said, and Andreas said also, my name is Jeff Andurio. I'm a technical solutions architect in the mobility and access team over at WWT. I've been with WWT about 7 to 8 years. I've got a pretty broad base of experience across routing, switching, wireless, service provider, data center, and I've been doing quite a bit of automation in both Python and Ansible. And I hail from down here in South Jersey, just outside of Philadelphia. And my email is on the screen if you'd like to reach out to me at some point. So the agenda for today, what we're going to walk through is, number one, I'm going to sort of level set. Many of you probably have heard of DNA Center, but in the event that you haven't, we're going to just touch on it, just to cover basically what it is, and we'll take a quick look at the GUI, the UI for it. And then we're going to go into, we'll talk a little bit about the ATC, WWT's Advanced Technology Center, and what type of environments we have in there related to DNA Center and SD Access. Then we'll talk about our automation approach to how we're managing and what our use case is for automating those labs. And then I'll get into some new modules that we're developing in a short demo of those modules. So DNA Center in less than 5 minutes. So you're obviously not going to learn everything that there is about DNA Center in less than 5 minutes, but we'll do our best to give you some idea of what its purpose is. And so just to break it down at the highest level, DNA Center, not to be confused with DNA, which is a framework, but DNA Center is an appliance. It's a network controller targeted at campus environments that provides two main functions. The first main function is automation. And the approach that Cisco is taking to automation from DNA Center's perspective is really to simplify the configuration of the network infrastructure beneath the controller that it's taking control of. And it does that through a series of different sort of abstractions within the GUI that allow you to define the intent of what you're trying to accomplish and not have to focus on specific CLI commands or the specific platform-based configuration. A good example of that might be application policy in DNA Center, where if you're familiar with APIC-EM, the sort of the predecessor controller, it's similar to EasyQoS, and what it allows you to do is really specify your QoS policy more abstractly than if you've ever done QoS. You have to get down into every different platform has a different implementation and different CLI commands, and it's based on the hardware, et cetera. So what they're trying to accomplish in DNA Center and what they're doing is really providing you a simple way to define how I want my network to look and deploy it from DNA Center. And then the second main component is assurance. So once I've designed the network and put together how I intend it to look, I need a way to validate that it's actually performing at the level and in the way that I wanted it to do. So the second function, assurance, it's called Network Data Platform, or NDP, and it essentially ingests telemetry from a variety of different sources that we won't necessarily get too deep into on this call. But just to name a couple: NetFlow Performance Monitor, AAA servers, DHCP snooping. So it's pulling information in from a variety of different places and really doing a correlation and analysis to produce actionable insights that will allow you as the network operator to ideally predict when issues are going to occur, resolve issues faster, and have better visibility into what's happening on the network. So I am going to take just a quick look at the UI. So I'll jump over to the UI. If you've not seen it, this is the main landing page for DNA Center. It's essentially divided into two main areas. The top area consists of 4 applications. The design application is focused primarily on putting together that intent I was talking about earlier, or the automation of how I want my network to look. So you can put together, even before you ingested or discovered your topology or any of your devices, you can put together what you want your network to look like. And I'm going to dive down into that one in just a second. Policy is sort of the second step in the process if you're thinking of it in an ordinal way. Policy would be me defining how and what you can access when you do gain access to the network from a security policy perspective, and it's also where you would configure application policy. So how do I want my applications treated on the network once I deploy that policy? And so these first two, these top 2 layers or apps really are what you would do prior to pushing it out to the environment. So you can, in advance, put together all of your design and your policy. And then the provision app down, the next one down on the left here is how you would deploy what you've designed and the policy you've put together out to your network devices. And then the final over on the right from network visibility, and I talked about it as one of the 2 main functions. Assurance is really the place where you'll go to validate the health and the operation of that environment. Then the second main area is the tools. A lot of these tools are integrated through these other apps up top, but we're not going to get too deep into those today, but there's a variety of different tools, like you can run commands across your environment, manage your inventory, view your topology, and there's image repository for software management, and template editor for deploying CLI templates, and a couple others there. So just to dive into the design app, I'm not going to go through all these apps, but I did want to jump into design, mostly to provide you visibility into this is a fully unconfigured DNA Center. So there is no configuration on this today. At the end, we're going to use Ansible modules in order to configure all the settings. But essentially, the way that the DNA Center works is you can define a network hierarchy over here on this first tab in whatever way that logically meets your needs or your customer's needs to represent the network. And really, this hierarchy are essentially they're containers for where you can house different configuration elements. So you can have different configuration elements. If you divided it into, if we were just looking at the United States over on the left of the screen here, let's just say we had West, Central, and East. We may have different time zones, NTP servers, AAA servers. So there's a good reason to build out a hierarchy and then to sort of manage your settings within the containers of that hierarchy. And then the network settings, again, just to illustrate that they're all empty, but there's a variety of different settings that are sort of global from a configuration perspective, not from a hierarchy perspective, but global meaning within sort of global configuration. But if you think about like DNS server, DHCP servers, syslogs, SNMP servers, and time zones, et cetera, there's a couple others that are hidden by default, but all these settings are things you would put into place, and then when you provision your devices into a particular container within the network, they would assume and pull all these configurations down into their configuration. Just across the top quickly here, device credentials are, the credentials we would use to access the devices that we ingest and manage. We'll create IP pools and service provider profiles and manage your wireless. All this would be done through the design app. So what we're going to do is jump back over to the presentation. We'll come back to this in a little while when we get to the demo portion. And so that now that you've sort of seen the UI, there's another way to provision, and this is what we're going to get into towards the last half of the presentation. But in June at Cisco Live, Cisco released sort of DNA as a platform. The APIs have been there since somewhere in the January timeframe, but they're making a concerted effort to open up the platform and make it more accessible programmatically, allowing for app-to-app communication. And so they're really creating APIs that allow you to deploy the intent. You can monitor, pull state and device health information. And as you'll see in my use case, and I'm sure there are several others we could think of around self-service portals, but from my perspective, it allows for higher level orchestration where perhaps you or your network teams need to automate more than just the network. For instance, maybe you're automating storage or virtual machines on a VMware or otherwise. So all that can be done through some higher level orchestration. Moving on, and the APIs are available. There's a couple links at the end of the slide deck that'll be available to you on the website, linked inside the webinar. And the links, there's a couple of DevNet links that provide a great insight into and all the documentation related to the APIs and how to assemble the data and how to make the calls. There's also some really great information about how to work through some workshops and gain some experience with the APIs on DevNet. Again, there's some links at the end of the presentation for that. Moving on, so they are REST APIs. So most of you are likely familiar, but it's representational state transfer. It's transport as an HTTP protocol, and it's very simple to understand and it's obviously gaining wide adoption. But there's the 4 methods currently supported on the Cisco APIs are get, to essentially retrieve information from the system, and there's a bunch of different API calls for the different elements that you can extract information from. There's post to create new objects, put to modify existing objects, and then delete to obviously remove objects from the system. I included this URI format, and there's 2 reasons for me to include it. Number one, I think it's interesting to understand if you are going to start working with the APIs, what the structure is, and you can see that the protocol, HTTP or HTTPS in this case, followed by the host, which is your target system, and followed by the resource, the path of the API of interest, and then the parameters following the question mark there. So that's the structure of what a REST API or the URI format of what a REST API call will look like. The second reason that I show this is I think it's interesting when we start talking about the Ansible modules that you're not going to actually have to know any of this, that I've put together these modules that will abstract that sort of level of logic from what you have to understand, making it more accessible. So DNA Center in the ATC, number one, I think I wanted to just level set real quick or provide an understanding. ATC at WWT is the Advanced Technology Center. We have 3 data centers with, I think, 300 racks or so of networking equipment that's entirely dedicated to training, labs, testing, integration, and really gaining experience on integrated solutions for our internal engineers and our customers' engineers. So you really kick the tires and try out new technologies and integrating different technologies before you move them into your production environment. It's like, for me, it's sort of a technology playground. And it's one of the most compelling reasons why I continue to work with WWT. DNA Center, from a DNA perspective, we have, of those 300 some odd racks, We have several racks that have DNA Center topologies in them. We have 11 distinct environments that we use for training, R&D, and demos. In the training, we actually have a one-day class devoted to educating our customers on DNA Center and SD Access, and that includes 5 different pods to host up to 10 users. It's full hands-on labs. We have a couple of self-study environments that are used mostly internally. We have some R&D where we keep tabs and keep pace with the newest releases and try to test and break and figure out what the new features, how they work and how they operate. And then demos that we're giving all the time to customers. I think one last point on this slide really is the multiple capabilities. So when I talk about capabilities, I'll mention environments, and environments is sort of the physical underlying infrastructure, and capabilities are the logical topologies we put on top. So we might have multiple physical topologies or multiple capabilities that are logical riding on top of a single physical topology in our labs. This is just a quick example of what we'll be automating and what we'll be talking about when we get into more of the modules. But this is a typical environment of those 11 environments dedicated to SD Access DNA Center. They have a couple switches. We've got DNA Center controller appliances in each of the pods, each of those 11 pods. They'll all have an identity services engine for security policy, routers, switches, and wireless LAN controllers. They'll also have a handful of virtual machines in each to act as number one, the ICE, but also virtual clients in order for testing and validation. So these 11 labs, slightly different than what you would experience in a production environment. There's a very cyclical nature in the labs, how they're consumed and how they're reused. So we have basically the life cycle of the lab is we have an engineer will reserve and say, I want to utilize this capability ABC, in this case DNA Center SD Access, call it pod 1. And when that reservation becomes active, we need a way to set it up and make sure it's ready for that engineer. So configure all the routers, switches, wireless LAN controllers, the appliances, security, identity services engine, and make all that stuff in a state that the end user can work through whatever the lab guide or demo is for him. And then once that setup is done, the engineer will execute the lab, and eventually his reservation will expire. And at that point, we'll need a way to tear down those devices and reset them back to a known starting point. And so this cyclical nature is really what drives, I think, a high need and easily justifiable reason for automation. It's almost perfect use case for automation. It's highly repeatable and it's highly automatable. And so keep this in mind as we work through the rest of the presentation. This is what we're driving towards and what we're aiming at. And that really leads us to automating in the ATC. And so when we started building these new environments, and I'm focused specifically on these DNA Center SD Access environments in this case, but we set out with the goal of dynamically provisioning all the elements of these environments to a predetermined state accurately and with no manual intervention. So we have a fairly small team, like most of our customers. We don't have dozens of people sitting around who can manually provision these things. So with that in mind, no manual intervention was sort of a key element. And then in the boxes at the top, I like to say these are some of the benefits or sort of auxiliary goals. Number one is increased scale, and this was not just increased scale of our resources, the human resources, but also of the capabilities or of the physical environments. So allowing me to dynamically say today this is going to be call it a traditional spanning tree environment, or tomorrow it's going to be we're going to baseline it to I want to at a 0 starting point for user XYZ, and then the next day I want to roll that same capability forward to he wants it at the end state so he can go in and work beyond the lab guide that was provided. But the second area really is reducing errors, because I don't know about all of the engineers on the call, but I know for me, if I had to consistently type something over, and chances are I'm going to make mistakes. I'm just human, and that's part of human nature. So automation, in this case for me, is a way for us to eliminate the I forgot that command, and that's why that capability doesn't work for the customer. So we're really trying to drive towards providing a predictable and reliable environment for our consumers, in this case, the engineers, both internal and external. And then lastly, reducing effort. Obviously, that's part of increasing our human scale, but reducing the workload so that we can move forward and innovate in other areas. That's sort of our goals and what we're looking at and how we want to automate. So that really led us to a decision to utilize Ansible Tower. And I wanted to put together just a couple reasons why we're using Ansible Tower and Ansible in general. But number one, top reason for us was it's ease of adoption. So it's written in YAML. It's very human readable. You don't have to necessarily be a programmer, although maybe some programmatic thought processes are helpful. A lot of us are network engineers or network architects, and so we're not full-time developers. And quite honestly, this is a transition that a lot of our customers are starting to look at also. And so it makes a very low barrier of entry for us and for our customers to use Ansible Tower and to use it in this way. Second is the existing modules. And if you're on this call, you probably already know, but there's hundreds of modules. Andreas talked about a few that were coming out new in 2.6, and they just continue to add to that portfolio of modules. And almost anything that you need to do can be done. And if it can't, you can always write your own modules, which I'll show you here at the end. The third main reason was the API. So we have, and we'll get into this a little bit, but we had a need to, whatever automation platform we chose needed to have an open API that allowed us to make calls from other systems in order to trigger that automation for our environments. And then the last reason for choosing Ansible, and this as a platform for automation for us, was the historical logging capability. We could have done automation and just using Ansible Engine, but in this case, we also wanted the ability to go back and track, in addition to the other things, but from a historical logging perspective, go back and look at, well, why did the playbook not execute properly? And why did our automation not succeed? So those are the reasons that led us to choose Ansible Tower. Moving on to getting into what we're automating. Now, I showed you the diagram earlier, and we talked a little bit about this, but essentially we have virtual machines, we have the DNA Center appliance, and we have network equipment. From a virtual machine perspective, we're using a handful of modules that already existed. We didn't have to write anything new there. We have VMware Fax. We're just grabbing some VM information. We use VMware Guest to power up, power down VMs, and VMware Guest Snapshot in order to roll back and forward those virtual machines to known states based on where in the lab guide we want to start. And the Ansible, the DNA Center appliance was a little bit different. There are APIs, which we talked about earlier. So we started out using the URI modules to make those REST API calls. And essentially the approach was, and still is to a degree, but to utilize backup and restore points. So build the system to the state you want it to be at, create a backup, and now we can make API calls using the URI module in order to restore to that point. And the second mechanism really is these new Ansible modules that I'll get into in here just in a second. From a switching and router configuration perspective, we're using iOS config, iOS command. We're using Jinja tablets. All of this automation is run through Ansible Tower, and all of it is stored in GitHub as sort of a single source of truth. At a high level, I mentioned the API requirement for Ansible Tower as one of the reasons we selected it. Looking at this structure, these are the components of our current automation flow within these 11 environments we're talking about today. Quali is our reservation system, so it handles resource contention and scheduling of these environments and capabilities. And so when a reservation becomes active within the Quali system and it's handled the contention, there's no conflict for resources, a reservation will become active, and that'll trigger an API call to Ansible Tower. Once Ansible Tower receives that API call, it'll execute the playbook associated with that template, and that will trigger the automation we were talking about in the prior slide with snapshot rolling back or rolling forward, Jinja templating, and or calls to DNA Center through the URI module. And that takes us to use case number 1. And this, just to dive a little bit deeper, so what this slide is illustrating is one of the challenges that we ran into. I was mentioning the backup and restore mechanism for DNA Center that we were using, making URI module calls to initiate both a baseline and an end state. One of the challenges that we ran into with this really was that the backups were highly version dependent, and DNA Center, like any platform, probably the backup is highly dependent on the versioning. Also, being a new product, DNA Center, their release cycle is fairly aggressive, with a new minor release coming out somewhere in the 2 to 3 week range, major releases coming out every quarter. So we were trying to keep pace with that, became somewhat challenging. And the process really is, I would have to roll back to a baseline, upgrade the software, and then build the system to the end state that I wanted and recreate that end state backup so that I could have those 2 restore points. That really limited the number of restore points I could have. And for our lab environment, it would be useful to be able to say roll forward to different points within our lab guides. We have a variety of lab guides that could be 100 or 150 pages long, and perhaps you don't want to execute all of that. You want to roll forward and only do the QoS part, or roll forward and only do the wireless part. Today, that's too overwhelming or too task intense to have multiple checkpoints in the middle. And that's really what drove me to develop these Ansible modules for configuring the DNA Center. And so what I have developed so far is the DNA Center modules targeting the DNA Center as a platform are, when we were looking through the GUI, and we'll go back in shortly here, but building out all of the group hierarchy can be done programmatically using Ansible modules. All the common settings, so DNS, DHCP, NTP, NetFlow, all the settings on that second tab in that I was showing you, all have modules developed for them. Creating and managing global credentials, assigning credentials to different points in the hierarchy. You might have different user credentials at different locations or different regions. Creating discoveries. So if you wanted to generate a new discovery in order to either stand up a new site or pull in new network resources, creating IP pools, and then assigning roles and site assignments to devices. All of those have been created. There's definitely more that could be done, but those are what's done so far today, and that we'll be able to demonstrate. And so let me go over to here, log in. This is the live demo portion of it, and we know how live demos go, so this is going to be perfect. But what we're going to do, first, this is the playbook I'm going to execute. Actually, you can see all the modules up top here, but the playbook I'm going to execute is just, I'm going to execute it at the CLI using, not using Ansible Tower, but just using Ansible Engine. Just for demonstration purposes, but at the top I just have some variables. These represent both the roles, creating the hierarchy, and the top is just the roles and the site assignments. So I'm going to go through and create all the sites, create all of the roles, so assigning the roles to different devices once we've discovered them at the end. And then I'll just scroll through. We're not going to go through all of this, but just to highlight, I showed you the URI for the REST API call earlier. Again, the idea is to break these down and make them as simplistic as possible and as single function as possible. So for instance, creating that hierarchy is just a single module, and it takes just a couple parameters in order to build out that hierarchy. And same with all the modules as we scroll through. So we've got DHCP server, DNS servers, syslog, SNMP, NetFlow. So we'll create all these time zone and a banner, and then we'll create some users. And then as all this runs, and I'm going to just kick it off while I finish going through the file, because it will take a little bit of time. As it all runs, we'll watch over here. We'll create credentials, and then at the end, I'll create a discovery that'll go out and discover the 4 network devices that are in the topology, and then it'll wait for those to become in a managed state. So the first thing that happens after you discover your topology with DNA Center is it has to ingest the configuration and basically import all of the elements of that device before you can manage anything else. So we'll let that run. You can see right now it's building the group hierarchy, and as that runs, let me just pop back over, and I got another slide. I just wanted to talk briefly while that's running about the structure or the architecture of how I put these modules together. At the bottom in gray is a helper network module, which essentially is has the responsibility of all of the cross-module or module independent functions like logging into the DNA Center, managing the CRUD operations, so create, read, update, and delete functions. There's some geoparser functions in there for doing things like time zone lookups or lat long lookups for when you create buildings within DNA Center. So that module along the bottom is a helper module designed to basically abstract all of the module independent function calls from the actual Ansible modules up top. And then all the modules, you can see there's 16 of them today. The colors sort of represent, the orange is global level functions that you create, or global level objects. And then all the blue are anything that could be site specific, so you can create them at the global level within that DNA Center hierarchy, but you can also create them and assign them independently at every sub element or every sub container below global if you needed to. And then over on the right, the green represents sort of call them actions or operational actions. So once I've created all the credentials, as an example, I may need to assign the credentials. Creating a credential just creates it within the system at a global level. You also have to activate it at whatever level within the hierarchy that is pertinent for your environment. And so let's go back over and see how we're doing here. So no red. So far we've got a good demonstration here, which is always nice. We've gone through and you can see DNS servers, DHCP, NetFlow. So right now it's configuring all those settings. Let me jump back over to the GUI while that's running, and we can just validate that this system that was blank when we started to receive some of these configurations. You can see we've built out Central, East, West. We've got Maryland Heights in a single building already built out, which matches what I had in the parameters or the variables section of the YAML file. We can jump over to the network settings, and we can see that all of the network settings that we intended to push out have been pushed out. And we've created device credentials. I mentioned that you create the device credentials at the global level and then assign them at a lower level. So I'll click down into Central, and you can see that the playbook that I created assigned them at the central level, which is good. That's looking good. We created an IP pool. We've actually not created that at that level because that's the global level. So at the global level, we've created an IP pool. So everything's looking good. Let's go back over to our playbook, and we've created a discovery, and this is where I'm going to pause and wait for it to discover before moving that playbook on after a couple minutes there. So we can see that it is discovering, and it has actually already discovered all 4 devices. And so why we're waiting at this point is really to make sure that it gets these into a managed state over here. So while we wait for that, I'm going to jump back over to the slides, and we'll just round out these slides before validating that one last time. So the benefits of the new modules for us and really anybody are they enhance the overarching automation strategy. Again, if you've got an automation needs that go beyond, in this case, DNA Center is an automation platform, but if your needs are broader than just the network elements that DNA Center can automate, you may have a broader strategy that you want to automate. So that's where these modules could be helpful, specifically if you're using Ansible for automation. Expose a simplified wrapper for DNA Center. So again, the APIs are released, the APIs are available. If you're so inclined, you could write in whatever language of your preference. You could make API calls, but that would obviously make you have to understand the mechanisms of the REST calls, the data structures that you have to pass in, etc. So these Ansible modules simplify that for you and allow you to just provide the data necessary for the objects you want to create. And then for us specifically, they created a flexibility in the lab that are going to allow us to create those multiple checkpoints within a lab and move from point to point in a more flexible way with less rebuild and less labor on our part to get them to those states. And then let's just one last slide, and then we'll do one last look at the environment. The key takeaways: DNA Center is an interface for the network. So DNA Center as a platform allows you to have a single point of contact to provision your network devices that are being managed by it. DNA Center Ansible modules expand your automation options. So we just talked about that. Excuse me. We just talked about that, allowing you to have a broader automation capability. And automation is fundamental. It's becoming a fundamental requirement for all of our, most of our customers, and definitely for us in the ATC. We don't really have the option of doing these things manually anymore, both from a reduction of time and effort, but also in consistency of our output. Speed I see sort of as a healthy side effect of automation. To me, it's more about being concise and being accurate every single time. And Ansible is powerful. So let's go back and one last validation. We should be able to, oops, get this guy going here. And what we'll do is one last check over here. We should all be in a managed state, which they are. It's going through now and it's assigning the roles. So DNA Center does automatically make some assumptions about the role based on a couple criteria like device type as an example, but some of them will not be correctly assumed. So I've set those up in the variables at the top of the file to make sure they all get the right role. So if we were to look at, I can't actually see this, here we go. If we were to look at here, we could turn on the device role and you can see that it should, after I refresh, have all the right roles now. And then finally, you'll see the site get assigned, and that's the end of that playbook. So the last thing before we wrap up is once this finishes, I'll say that the majority, all but assigning credentials, all of these modules are fully idempotent, meaning we can run them over and over again. And if the DNA Center is in the state that we specify, it's not going to go and execute anything against the DNA Center. So you can see here as we're running it a second time, everything's going to come back green with no change because all the module or all the state we've just made sure is already in the state that we want it in. So with that, we'll flip back over, and that is the end of the presentation. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you today, and we can go, Andreas, to any questions.
Absolutely. We have got lots of really good questions, of really good ones. I really appreciate it. We're going to hang in there. We'll do 3 or 4 questions. So one of the first ones I think was the actual modules you're using. Are they posted somewhere, and where are they licensed somehow? Can people use these modules, or are they available yet, or is this kind of like a preview?
Great idea. Great question. So they are not posted publicly yet. Our intent is, WWT's intent is to make them open and available. So we will, I believe, ideally by the end of this week, have them out on WWT's GitHub and allow you to pull those. Andreas, I think what we can do, and you tell me if we can't do this, is put a link in the webinar notes that will be where they can find those.
We can absolutely do that. Absolutely, we can do that. Sure.
Perfect. So expect that by the end of this week.
Cool. Great. The next question is, I guess there were some lessons learned. So that, there were some questions about why would you even want to use Ansible when DNA Center is an automation platform already, right? So give us some lessons learned. You all, WWT has been an expert in, say, ACI, right? Kind of a similar idea, but for data center. Is this why, can you compare and contrast, why you use Ansible as opposed to just ACI or just DNA Center again? I know you mentioned it a little bit earlier, but can you bring some clarity, why Ansible with, why would you want to automate the automators, right? So kind of leading you there.
Yeah. And I think at the very highest level, I'll say, if you could picture, if you look at networking and just networking by itself, we've got, you might have a wireless LAN controller, you might have a network controller in the campus. Perhaps that network controller is controlling the wireless controller, but you're also going to have a data center controller, which is the APIC. You mentioned ACI. Excuse me. I think the most, or at least the most pertinent example for me is just that higher level of orchestration. I think a second example is, well, let me finish that thought. So higher level orchestration, I mentioned it a couple times, but just to be clear, just make sure I have it out there clearly from my perspective is, if I need to automate, let's just say I want to create a security policy or something across multiple things, like I've got an APIC for the data center, I've got a DNA Center for the campus, and I also need to automate within VMware. Maybe it's NSX, or maybe it's just spinning up virtual machines like we're doing here. That higher level, Ansible allows me to use the existing modules to automate across different OEMs and different functional areas that, like, I can't use DNA Center today to automate the ACI fabric in the data center, or to automate creating virtual machines within VMware. So to me, stepping up one level above that allows me to do that and use Ansible for that purpose. The second use case that I would offer up is really around self-service portal. So if you think about, once I have this out there and functional, operationally, I may want to have, specifically around DNA Center, let's just say I needed to update my credentials, or I needed to add a virtual network in a region to a bunch of sites. The APIs allow you to do that, and the modules abstract the APIs. So if you do have that higher level of orchestration, or you have a need to have like a ServiceNow self-service portal that says, oh, I want to click this button and update all my NTP servers in the West region, then you can certainly do that through an API call to a playbook that's created, excuse me, on Ansible Tower. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think that's perfect. Yeah, and I think from an Ansible standpoint,
cool.
The nice thing here is, if all you have are devices that can be managed by DNA Center, that's perfectly fine, right? In many network environments, you're using a little bit of everything. You may have F5, you may have ASA, you may have Palo Alto, you may have light bulbs, anything. And Ansible can be your common language across all of those infrastructure platforms, including servers, right? Servers, containers,
exactly,
anything there. So the idea is, sure, you don't need Ansible to do what you need to do, but if you're trying to automate, if you're trying to go scaling out to your larger organizations, or if Ansible is familiar to you, many people, a lot of the cloud admins are started in the server space, and now are getting forced to start working in the network space. They may already know Ansible, and that could be their common language moving in. So instead of having to learn, DNA Center, they can just learn Ansible and interface in that way. Those are some options. Okay, two more questions. So one was, can Tower be used instead of Quali? And I think I answered, Quali is just setting up your lab environment. So I think that's specific for your sandboxing, I believe. Can you explain why you're using Quali in your demo?
Yeah, absolutely. The only thing that Quali is doing in this is really resource contention and reservation management. So it's not doing any of the automation in these particular labs. Quali can do automation, but in our use case, we're using Ansible for the automation piece. And so it's really a lab management system in our use case. We're not I don't know that that's necessarily a production use case, but for us, again, it's if you reserve lab number 1, I need to make sure that someone else doesn't reserve it at the same time. So it's resource contention and resource contention resolution, and then it's scheduling. So and it's just making an API call out to Ansible Tower.
Perfect, thanks. We still got some time here. So how much maintenance is required for modules and playbooks, given that DNA Center, they change their product a lot? Do they may change their APIs, et cetera? Is that going to be a challenge based on that? So it was more of maybe a roadmap, or seems like it was a question around increased maintenance around these things, if there's any commentary there.
Yeah, so that's always going to be a risk, I think, if you're writing against someone else's APIs, that the APIs, could change. But I will say that I started writing these sort of in my, in my spare time in March or April, and against the 1.1 platform at the time. I think it was 1.1.5 when I started. So they're in the 1.1 series. They're up to 1.1.8, but they also have released 1.2, which was really where they made public the APIs. If you knew where to look, you could find them and you could write against them. And why I say that is that when they made the jump to 1.2 and they released them, I've retested all of these against the latest version 1.2.2, and I've not had to rewrite any of it. So I've been able to run it across the 1.1 and the 1.2 without any issues. The only thing I rewrote sort of voluntarily was how I was doing authentication. I was using a URI that they had said they were going to deprecate, which was just using cookies, and I went to a token, which is how they're doing authentication now. But other than that, I mean, that's always going to be a risk, in my opinion, when you're developing against someone else's APIs. But so far, it's been pretty consistent across the versions, and I haven't had a whole lot of issues.
And I guess I was going to supplement that is, given when these modules get posted upstream, and it's going to be an open source license, this is going to allow for the community to get more involved, right? And so you're going to actually have some really good development. All the goodness you get from open source, you're going to get from the maintenance and support from these modules in the community, I think. So last question, and we're going to sign off here. And this one looks like does Ansible play a role in service assurance similar to other orchestrators such as Anudis, NSO, et cetera? So I would say do not use Ansible as a service orchestration. Do not do that. It is an automation platform. It's an automation platform. If anyone tells you Ansible does service orchestration, then that's not true. We don't want to do that. We do what we do, and that's automating tasks. So we work very, very closely with orchestrators such as NSO. We do actually have there are NSO modules, right? So you can actually do the same things like we're doing, very similar to here. With DNA Center and with ACI, you can actually there are NSO modules posted, and they've been in since I think 2.4, Ansible 2.4, and there's probably there are NSO NEDs for Ansible, so through your NSO rep. So the NSO plus Ansible is the right story, right? That's a definite better together story. So it's not going to be an either or. Now, there are certain circumstances where you could actually do certain, NSO could do some automation, et cetera. But when you're talking about service orchestration, you definitely want to leave that to the tools that actually do that best. And I don't know if you, Jeff, if you had any, I don't know if you all do NSO or any service orchestration, but that's our feeling from the Ansible BU there.
No, that's perfect. And I don't necessarily work with NSO, but that's I think that's a solid answer.
Okay. Well, perfect. I think we're right. We're going to leave a few more minutes. I think we got all the questions we had. Really appreciate everyone's time. Thank you so much, Jeff and Tom, for managing the questions board. Again, we're going to have this posted to the Ansible webinars page here in the next week or so. We'll have links to everything that you've seen here, the modules, etc. And if you need to get a hold of us, feel free to send us an email. You can send it to ansible-network@redhat.com, or anyone here at Ansible. Talk to myself, Andreas. Talk to Jeff at WWT. Happy to work with you together to get your solution going. And with that, thank you so much for your time, and we'll see you next time again. Take care. Bye bye.
Thank you.